Hey, Malaysia's Prime Minister said Monday that Flight 370 did in fact go down in the Indian Ocean.
And back with us to talk about the latest in the search is former military pilot and aviation expert Justin Green and Evy Poumpouras, former Secret Service agent. So welcome, guys. Thanks again for being here.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Why did it take 17 days to get to this point?
Well, I think, first of all, this seems to be the end of the beginning of the story. You know, as Churchill would say, there's going to be a lot more coming out later on. But the bottom line is they had very limited information. They basically had one data set. And what they did is they actually used physics and math to take a look at that data set and come up with this conclusion, which I think is very reliable because it matches what both Evy and I were thinking, that this is in the ocean.
Yeah. It takes 17 days to come up with that?
Well, this is the thing. The company, Inmarsat is the company, the British satellite company, and it's a private company. They're the ones who actually came up with the solution, and they've never done anything like this before. It's unheard of. And they're the ones who actually have their product installed basically inside the plane. So even though the transponders were off and the 8 cars were off, basically their product, the mechanics was still sending signals to their satellite. So they used that with math and all that together, and they came up with these. They used the Dopplers, as Justin and I were talking about, and they actually came up with the probable path of the plane. And they're pretty set. Like this is where the plane went down.
I had an interview with the head of that corporation. He said they had this information 12 days ago.
See,
that's right.
Yeah.
And they had it 12 days ago. They told the officials, but for some reason, they don't want to point any fingers, the officials decided not to release it. And just now we're hearing, following up on that, what about these reports of them texting the information to family members?
Well, first of all, they sat on the information for those 12 days, okay? And then they rushed it out at the end. So they basically said, look, we're now going to release it publicly, but first we want to tell the families. So what they're saying is they talked to some of the families personally. I'm sure they try to reach out on the telephone to talk to some of the families, but then they just sent a mass text.
Should they have done that?
You know, I have to say, like, that's not something we would ever see here. I mean, you know at some point that's highly probable you're going to have to tell these families. So from the get-go, you set up some way where you can communicate with them personally. You know, and even everyone's saying, okay, well, they were spread out somewhere in China, somewhere in Kuala Lumpur. Whatever the case may be, you hold a briefing. You have somebody either in person or even on the phone. You're sending a text message. Why don't you text them to a phone number so they can call, so you can at least give them that courtesy?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, the NTSB does is they have a briefing for the families before anyone else finds out about it, before the media finds out about it, for the public finds out about it. So the families are not going to get a text, and they're not going to turn on the TV and find out their loved one is dead.
Well, of course. Well, that's the hope. But now, let's talk about, what are your thoughts on the ghost plane theory?
I never bought that theory.
And if you could just go over it a little bit
sense.
for those people who don't know what the ghost plane theory is.
Well, let me tell you, there's been a lot of theories. There have been people on TV saying it's in Pakistan. There have been people saying it's in Iran. There have been people saying it's being loaded up with weapons to come and do a further attack. And then there's this ghost plane theory that there was basically 2 planes involved, and that they're getting the signal from this quote-unquote ghost plane. But it doesn't make any sense to me, and nobody who I believe is reliable, even on the aviation side or the security side, is buying into that theory.
I will say one thing, though. I know there's a lot of theories, and some of them are very outrageous, but I think it's also important to have imagination when you're an investigator. And, you know, I think back to September 11th, and I think it's because our intelligence community, our investigators, I mean, as a whole, we lacked imagination. And if I would have told you all those years ago, you know, what was going to go down, the 4 planes being hijacked with box cutters and the towers completely collapsing, you would have thought I was completely bonkers. So although some of these conspiracies seem outrageous, I do think it's healthy and appropriate that when we look at these things, we have that imagination, because the bad guy, the terrorist, I assure you, he has imagination.
So in a big sense, this is an excellent exercise, but in your professional opinion, how did this plane get down there, and why did it go down where it did?
Well, in my opinion, and this is, let me tell you something, there's a lot of speculation. I'm going to speculate right now. I believe it is a mechanical problem, and there's only 2 potential causes that could knock out the radios or knock out the pilots. One is onboard fire that was contained so that it knocks out the pilots, knocks out maybe the communications, but doesn't take the airplane down. The longest an airplane's ever been able to fly with an onboard fire is the Swissair 111 accident, and that's only about 20-30 minutes. So flying hours with a fire on board is somewhat unbelievable. The other one is a massive decompression where the pilots are not able to don their masks and get knocked out before they're able to do something. The airplane continues to fly either on autopilot or in a trimmed up position until it runs out of gas or crashes.
I do agree with Justin. I do think that those are the most likely scenarios, but because nothing's really for sure with this case.
Right.
I do think we still have the possibility of a suicide with the pilot, even though I think that's lessened to a degree. And I do think that there is a possibility of hijacking because at the end of the day, we cannot say for sure. So I think we can't rule those things out.
Right.
I do think his is the most likely scenario, and I do agree with it. But I do think that yes, we have to keep that option open because it's highly probable because there's so many inconsistencies, you know, as far as with the plane going to 12,000 feet and then, you know, then going back up to 35,000 feet. I talked to a lot of aviation pilots and they told me that can't be done on autopilot. Somebody manually has to do that.
Right.
So
Well,
again, is that factual or is that, you know, just, you know, hearsay, so to speak?
Right, and that's based on radar data that is not particularly reliable. So whether that happened or not remains to be seen.
So much more to talk about.
Well, Justin Green and Evy Poumpouras, thanks for sharing your insight and expertise. And